Howdy, everyone. My name is John Fitzgerald. I'm giving a presentation on observe, interpret, apply, keep these steps separate. This is kind of a more abstract discussion than we've had for the conference up to this point. This is more about decision-making, problem-solving, and collaborative communication. Who am I? I am someone who asks why. From an early age, I would always ask why. I love software, I love problem solving, and I love people. But for like many of you here, probably people are a little hard, and software makes a little bit more sense. The button's not working. Okay. So we all need to solve problems for our jobs, for our work, for communicating with people and family, etc. We all need to work with people. And sometimes working with people is a harder problem than the problem we're trying to solve. A solution is clarity of thought, which leads to clarity of communication. So if you think clearly in your own processes as you communicate with other people, then you can have clear communication. How do we do that? And what are the barriers? People are imperfect. Humans, we take time to accomplish things, and we don't know everything. We want to do a good job, and if you assume that everyone wants to do a good job, you'll generally do better. We do need a little help. Everyone wants to do a good job, but they're imperfect, so they need help. We need each other, and we forget that sometimes. So communication is hard, and I am dissatisfied with the language about dealing with the imperfection of others and yourself. It's hard to know when you don't know something, and it's hard to let other people know that they don't know something. We often deal with third rails in communication where you deal with bumping into the edges of where someone really feels like they know something and you know better, or you don't know something, and dealing with the edges of these communications is really, really hard, and it often leads to drama, egos. It's a problem. We need a solution to deal with this problem. And so what I often found in the last year dealing with actual problems, like trying to solve a technical problem, solving the people problem was a harder problem. And I try to think about why is this a problem, and what's a good solution to it. So I learned in a study last year for studying one book, this technique: observe, interpret, apply, and keep these steps separate. The observation stage is determining what you can see, what can you observe, what's factual. An interpretation is what you think, and then an application is what you do. And the goal is to keep these steps separate from each other. You might quickly iterate between them, but in your communication with others and your thought inside, you keep track of where you are in this map. And you kind of, as you're communicating, you quickly iterate between these. And you guys probably already do this. In your own head, you might not have words, you have your own way of saying this. This is already how you do things. So I don't think that this is new to any of you. If you're good at communicating, you already do this, is what I would probably guess. So let's jump into what are these different steps: observation, interpretation, and application. And this applies in every single layer of communication and layer of thought. So this is a very abstract notion that is very applicable to everything that we do. So observation, observe. This is the most important step, and all of us need to get better at it, always. An observation is what you see. It's a collection of facts. It's read-only. So if you're in a conversation with someone and you need to observe, you treat them as kind of a read-only data source, where you're not trying to change who they are, you're trying to understand from them. You communicate, I don't understand, I want to learn, and as you're communicating with someone and you want to understand, the goal is to just get information. An observation is indisputable, it's objective. A collection of observations includes what's necessary to understand a topic, and complete. Those are the necessary and complete is kind of a definition of clarity, is including, necessary and complete, it defines how much do you need to observe as you're collecting information. So I was talking about imperfection earlier. Each of these steps, observation, interpretation, and application, has an area of imperfection and an assumption of imperfection that we're trying to correct. So with the observation phase, we're correcting a lack of information, and you want to correct this imperfection. And so we want to always assume that we lack information. You always want to assume that you lack information. Why? Because we miss details. People often skip this step and they jump to either interpretation or more often application. Can we just do this? We need to spend more time looking. We are blind to the obvious. This toy here, I did an exercise last year of observing where the whole class was given this toy and it was passed around the whole group, and we wrote down what we observed. I looked at it and I saw the different colors, all the different buttons, and I wrote down all the things. And then afterwards we debriefed what we observed, and it took like 15 to 20 minutes before someone noticed, it's a steering wheel. Like, the most important thing about this toy is that it's representing a steering wheel, and I totally missed that. So the most important thing is often what we miss. We're focused on all the details, but what it is what matters. And so this step of observation is incredibly important. We cannot make bricks without clay. Until you have observed properly, you cannot make a product. You cannot determine what's wrong with whatever the bug is going on. You have to properly observe. This step takes selflessness, stepping outside of yourself and recognizing what is true, regardless of what I think. It takes curiosity. It takes the willingness to say, I don't understand. All of this requires humility. Properly observing means stepping outside of yourself and being humble, being attention to detail. In communication with others, as you are observing, you have to avoid judgment and evaluation. There's a quote here, the ability to observe without evaluating is the highest form of human intelligence. And so in your exploration, you've probably already figured this out, that the best way to communicate with people and to understand is to just say what's true, what you can observe, and keep that separate from the interpretation step. So let's talk about interpretation. It's what you think. This is the step that many people get wrong and encounter problems in, especially when we're interacting with different interpretations. So what is an interpretation? An interpretation is what you think. A collection of explanations for what is happening. We're trying to recognize patterns, causations, explain causes. An interpretation is the answer to the question, why? What's the assumption of imperfection that this stage is trying to address? Biases. We all have low-resolution mental models of the world because we cannot possibly contain the whole world in our head. And so we have to somehow kind of guess at how the world works. That's the only way that human beings can operate. And so that's actually an assumption of how we operate as human beings. We have to approximate the way the world works, which means that we will sometimes be wrong in our assumptions. And so that makes us naturally biased. The language around biases and flaws in decision-making often is very judgmental in nature. When I talk about fallacies, when you're talking about various different things, you could not possibly in conversation say, you, sir, are using a whatever the fallacy is, maybe appeal to authority or whatever. As soon as you use that kind of language as you're talking to someone, when you recognize that they're doing it or when you yourself are doing it, it cuts off communication. So if we just assume that everyone is, as they navigate the world, as they try to solve problems, they are using low-resolution mental models that are sometimes going to be wrong, then we can all work together as a team to solve problems. So let's think about what a good interpretation is. A good interpretation is unbiased. It clearly states the assumptions of the interpretation. It has predictive power. We were talking about AI learning models, and we have to keep 80% of the data separate from 20% of the data so that we're training on the data, and it's the same principle for making sure that we're predicting things and we're not simply explaining what's happened in the past. It's based in observed evidence. A good interpretation is based in observation. A bad interpretation doesn't match what you actually see in the world. And this step addresses most of our primary conflicts if you properly, if you recognize the different interpretations involved. There's two different general kinds of opposing perspectives. There's opposite perspectives, where you're looking at the same thing and there's one person's right, another person's right, and you're arguing towards each other. And then a worse problem, which is you're arguing past each other, where you're saying different things and you different perspectives, and you're just arguing past each other and no one's saying anything. And both people could be right, but you're just, one person wants to be right, and it causes problems. And so if you think in these terms of people have perspectives that are separate from who they are, now we can talk about the perspectives, get everything on the table, and communicate. I like this thought: people are hardware. People have brains and circuitry in their brains for thinking, and it takes physical work to change and grow. And if you're talking to someone and you want them to change their perspective to your perspective, at the very least, in the best possible case, that's going to take time, it's going to take effort. You have to ask someone to do that. You have to get consent. You have to ask, would you like to change your mind? If someone doesn't want to change their mind, that's their prerogative. You're never going to accomplish that. That will be in their zone of effort. In your communication with other people, discussing interpretations and then realizing that it's really difficult to change people is just fundamental to communication. And allowing for grace, allowing for people to change and grow, and requesting that they do that is the right protocol for accomplishing that. And that will allow you to accomplish things. So let's jump to the application step. And how am I doing on time? Ooh, I think I'm going a little fast. All right. So the application phase. So this is when you're actually accomplishing something. An application is what you do. And it is a collection of plans. So an application is a sequence of operations that will achieve a certain goal. There can be multiple different applications for any given data set. You realize for any given bug, there's different ways to solve a certain bug. And it might even be based on different, one interpretation might have different applications to solve. I think of an application as right only. If you try to, what I mean by that is that's what you're doing in the world, and then you should observe what has happened as a result of your application. An application, a good application, is realistic. It's something that you could actually do. Often, we were talking about Scrum planning earlier. A problem that we often have is that we predict that the task will take too short of a time. And so it is not a realistic application, and so we end up being stressed about how much work we have, when we really could have just been a little bit more realistic, given 4 days instead of 2 days, that kind of thing. So with your applications, it's very important to be realistic. It's important to weigh the pros and cons of each of the different approaches. When proposing different applications, I always like to have no less than 2 options. I'd rather give the bad option to my manager and say, this is a bad option, we shouldn't do this, and this is why, than to not mention it, be afraid that he's going to ask about it. If it's so bad that we shouldn't do it, we should mention it. We should say why we've chosen not to do it. That promotes honesty and communication, and it allows for better communication. I want to go back to that slide. The assumption of imperfection here is that you're going to guess wrong. You're going to come up with an application that doesn't do what you want it to do, or you're going to find out that what you wanted to do was not even what is going to solve the problem. We as people will always improve iteratively. We can't just make giant steps. And so if you just assume that going in, that you're going to guess wrong, you're going to make mistakes, and that you're going to improve iteratively, you're not going to make a giant step all at once, then as we communicate about things, often we're afraid that this one thing, this one application is going to be either our make or break thing. The company is going to die if we don't do this one thing. And so if you instead step back and you realize, hey, we're imperfect. We're going to make mistakes here. Let's take one step forward, one step at a time, and realize that in that process we're going to make mistakes, and we're going to grow, and we're going to learn. And the more we do that, the more we iteratively improve, the better we'll be at coming up with good applications. So back to this slide here. As you're presenting to management, always present no less than 2 options. That allows your manager to make a decision about where the company will go. If he wants to decide the option that you think is not as good, it might be for a reason. Your interpretation of why we shouldn't go down this path might not be complete. It allows them to do their job. Often I ask for permission I ask for forgiveness rather than permission. I just go ahead and do it. And whenever I do that, it causes problems. It causes friction between me and coworkers. It causes conflict. And so being honest in your communication about what you're intending, why are you uncomfortable about a certain path? Why would you rather not even talk about it? Instead, if you get in the light and we discuss all the different options, then as a team, you can decide what we all want to do. And if one person doesn't want to do something, he should probably be able to communicate, I don't want to do this. And this is where being clear in your own thought process and this whole process of observe, interpret, apply is super useful, of inspecting yourself and why is a certain path uncomfortable? Why don't you want to do something? Is very, very important. And I always put do nothing is always an option. It's an option. It's a bad option sometimes. But sometimes, let's wait. Let's be more patient. Let's go through the process. Let's observe more before we do something. Is super helpful, and recognize we don't have to go. If we do something that's the wrong thing, that's going to take time out of our schedule, it's going to be a problem. So I think I've gone pretty quick over the whole process. So I'm actually curious for some. I think we have 10 more minutes, and I'm actually curious whether or not we can think of some examples as a group of going through this process. So can we think of, does anyone want to raise, I'm coming at this on the fly, so be patient with me. Because this is what I actually wanted to do, was, and I don't know how to say it really well, is can we think of, as a group, a way to go through this process? So like an example would be sarcasm. Someone says something, and I'm trying to think of like a precise thing that someone could say, where you observe what they say. There's words, there's tone, and so you can observe that with their tone of voice, they were potentially super monotone. So there's several interpretations you can take from their tone, but from their words you realize they don't really mean what they just said. And if they meant what they said, there would be problems. And so there can be multiple different interpretations of what someone has said. So this is logically dealing with sarcasm from comedy. And then there's different applications you can take based on those interpretations. Either he really meant what he just said, which is going to cause a problem for everyone. Let's say someone is sarcastic about something that they've decided. I'm struggling to come up with anecdotes on the spot.
You're talking
Yes.
about trying to understand humor
Yes.
cross-culturally. Right?
Yes.
It can be quite challenging. Humor is a really useful thing to help diffuse situations, and we've seen it through all these presentations people have done. But if you don't understand each other's humor, it can cause issues. And so you kind of have to this process could be applied to that, I think is what you're suggesting.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Anybody else?
Well, just my thought is that, besides words and way they're being said, like body language is important, but you don't get that on a phone call or a Zoom call. But also, worse than that, like in an email, if it's just text, it can be so hard to figure, interpret if someone really is joking or not.
Right.
That eliminates a lot of these dimensions when it's down in an email, so that can be really challenging too.
Does anyone else have like an area of like problem solving that they can think of that they would need to go through this process? Martin?
I see this whole process during like a retrospective.
Mm-hmm.
The team gets together, they all observe something different.
Mm-hmm.
And then you just can't even think, you have to go through an interpretation of what those observations are. And then decide after that how to interpret what to go forward to change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Perfect.
Something as simple as receiving feedback from a colleague has to go through this. Right? There can be a situation where you can observe what's being said to you, what's being communicated, as if it were intended as evaluation, when it's actually intended as coaching.
Yes.
You have to figure out, you have to be able to figure out and deduce from how they're communicating, what they're saying, what they're telling you. You have to be able to interpret it correctly in order to have the intended effect, because evaluation's intended effect is very different from coaching's intended effect for where you go forward.
Yeah. I didn't mention it, but the whole notion of if you combine interpretation and application into one step, you get judgment, where you've decided what your decision is and what you're going to do based on that. And now in your communication with someone, there's an assumed action. And so much of our language around judgment removes the ability to be discerning about, I think this is the result of what you're implying. Do you really mean that? And it removes, it really causes conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there was a hand over here.
Yeah, this really just looks like the issue reporting procedure.
Uh-huh.
Because you start with observation, and you got to be careful when you're making observations, because if you start it's very easy to bruise egos that way. People are very precious about their work, their code. They work hard on it and be like, no, you did it wrong. It's not going to make any friends.
Mm-hmm.
So you offer your observations, you may separately offer your interpretations, but you don't want to say again, here's what you did wrong.
Yeah.
So you need to work with them on the interpretation, and then you kind of pass off the application of that to the other person.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Like the people getting precious about their products. It's like people are proud of the work they do. This is one of these assumptions of imperfection. People are going to be proud about the work that they do. And if you say, hey, the thing that you've been working on for 5 years, we're not going to work on it anymore, or it's a bunk product, that's going to feel terrible. We're human beings. That's an expectation. And so if you're talking to someone and you realize that there's a problem in their decision making, it's going to be very difficult for that process. And so part of the observe phase is that you're keeping it to just what you can see. You're not evaluating it. You just see what you just said about in your review of something. I see that this is a problem. I don't need to jump to what are the different implications of it. But what do you see? Yeah, perfect. Anybody else?
So I don't really, it's not an example, but I did I think it was in the interpret slide where it talked about humility, is that right?
Yes.
And just the fact that you can't go in with your presumptions of what someone meant, but you got to be able to stand back and, you said, really trying to figure out what really the outcome was, and not just be offended or be mad or be whatever your maybe knee-jerk reaction is. To take that time to really understand the subject matter that you're reviewing.
Thank you.
Just an observation. I thought your insight, your statement about that everyone has sort of a limited view of the reality of the world, and I say a little more about that is that we have our own sort of view, like they say, rose-colored glasses. I see, and I mention this because for a lot of my life I used to, without realizing it, assume that the way that I saw things, people, reality, where I saw and felt about things was the way everyone did. Just I projected on my view, if I see it this way, it must be the way people see it. And your statement really makes it helps to make it clear that everyone has their own view about things, about a problem, about a situation, about a communication, about interpretation. And if you recognize that, you can sort of step back and take a deep breath and go, oh, maybe the way I'm seeing it is not quite, maybe how are they actually seeing it that may be different than how I'm seeing it, and then you can have some kind of better communication. So that's what I'm getting out of what you're saying.
Right, yeah. I think there's this view that I've come to of like just modeling people look from the top down, including myself in that top down view of like, I'm going in this direction, this person I'm talking to is going in this direction. One of us might be wrong here. It could be me, it could be them. Let's work on that, and like, it takes selflessness of going outside of yourself and recognizing that there are two human beings in the room that are trying to go in a direction. If you're with your partner and you're trying to work together as a couple to solve a goal, then there's a team that's trying to accomplish something in that relationship. And so recognizing that you're going to have two different perspectives, but you as a couple are trying to work together as a team allows you to take things in view of like, yeah, it's not about personality, it's not about who's winning, who's losing. You're trying to work together. And so the recognition that this is where diversity of views is really useful on a team. If everyone has the same perspective, why do we even have a team? Like, why are we working together? The diversity of perspectives is really what makes us useful as a team. And so using that to our advantage rather than as something that we're bumping heads over constantly is really useful. Thank you, Rich. Anybody else? Yeah?
I wonder if you have any suggestions on when to confront somebody, for example. For example, it might backfire when you have it happen, or it might actually help you. Because sometimes the problem, if you have a problem with somebody or whomever outside of work, let's say, they might be passive-aggressive or microaggressions and so on. So I've been in one situation where it completely backfired. But I wonder if there's such a thing as successful confrontation.
Yeah, so the question is about successful confrontation, where you recognize that someone's perspective is unuseful for probably either their own goal or the team's goal. And so how do you properly confront someone and try to correct their perspective? So the first rule is people are hardware. People will not change unless they want to change, is the first fundamental rule of human beings. People must want to change in order to change. And so if you want someone to change, you have to ask them. You have to there's a proper protocol for initiating such an operation. And if they don't want to do that, it's not going to happen. I've worked with friends who are addicts before, and they might know all of the facts about whatever medication, whatever, that they're imbibing, and they can describe exactly what they're doing, but they don't want to change. And so as you're talking to someone, going through the observe, interpret, apply processes, you can first ask questions to understand their understanding of a topic, and you hear from them their understanding, and it might be a correct understanding, and you go, okay, I want someone to change, but their issue is not a lack of information. Then you go to the interpret phase, and you go, okay, so what's your interpretation of this? Is this a problem? Whatever, if, in my friend's case, if he's taking some sort of drug that's I see as harmful, that's my interpretation, is that the results of this might be a problem. He comes at it and he sees a different perspective. Well, I don't see that this is very much a problem. It solves these issues in my life. I think that I should continue to do this. This is dealing with whatever risk. And so his application is different than mine. So even though we have different, we're looking at the same data, this drug or whatever has this result, and you're talking to your friend and saying, well, my interpretation is that you're not going to meet whatever goal if you continue to do this. And his interpretation is, well, I don't really want to do that. So as you're confronting people gently, in a loving way, you have the recognition that people don't change unless they want to. And you have to properly kind of go through the steps and ask questions, be curious in that observation phase about that time. But thank you for asking that question. Thank you.